Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. According to an article that I once read, at least at the time, one of the favorite attractions at the San Diego Zoo was the giraffe compound. It was a very natural habitat. Rather than one that looked like a zoo, it looked more like where the giraffes would have actually lived. And so this was the site where these magnificent animals then lived at the zoo. According to the article, understandably so, these animals were described as being just as tall and as graceful as one might imagine. But the article went on to say they're also much more massive and muscular than you might expect, especially when you look at their thick necks and when you look at their powerful legs. But the article went on to say that there's something else that catches a person's attention besides the animals themselves, and that's the very compound in which they are enclosed. Because, of course, in this natural compound, there are no bars and there are no walls. There's just a simple waterless moat that encircles that compound and those animals. A waterless moat that's probably no deeper than a giraffe's knee. So, freedom for all those animals within that compound, freedom is but 2 giraffe steps away. And yet they remain inside of that compound. They remain encircled by that moat. They are, in many ways, one might say, they are trapped there because not one of them will take the risk of stepping down and into or across that moat for fear of falling and for breaking a leg or maybe breaking a neck. Well, that's not only how those giraffes lived at the San Diego Zoo. That's the way people sometimes live. That's the way we sometimes live, as if we are trapped by something, as if we are trapped by something like that moat. Oh, just like at the zoo, there are no bars and there are no walls that are visible to anyone, but we know that they exist because they exist within our own hearts and with our own heads and minds. And in reality, the thing that leaves us and leaves us feeling in just that way, feeling trapped in just that way, is just plain old ordinary fear. And that's because fear, for us, just like for those giraffes, fear is a very powerful thing. But then any of us who have lived at any time in fear, we understand that. To one who is in fear, someone once wrote, everything rustles. And we understand that as well. We've lived with what that means. And we understand what another person meant when he wrote that they that live in fear are never free. And the disciples, they must have understood all that as well, for they knew firsthand the strong power of fear. I mean, here it was, as described in today's gospel, here it was less than 24 hours after the resurrection. It was the evening of that very first Easter Sunday, and yet today's gospel tells us that they weren't out celebrating this grand and glorious event. Today's gospel tells us that they were instead locked in a room, and that they were locked in that room because of the power of fear, the fear that was generated by being confused and by being worried, by trying to make sense out of a situation that made absolutely no sense to them, no matter how many different ways they must have looked at it. It must have seemed to them as they were in that room, it must have seemed to them as though everything they had dreamed about, as though everything they had hoped for, that everything they believed in had been taken away from them in the death of Jesus. And they didn't know who to blame, and they didn't know what to do. They didn't know who to trust. They didn't know where to turn. And they didn't know what to believe anymore. So caught up as they were in that situation and with those feelings, they must have been angry. They must have been afraid. They must have been confused. And that must have been true for all of them who were gathered together in that room. All those believers who were there, and yet only Thomas, only good old Thomas, was honest enough to express those same feelings out loud. Even though they must have all had their doubts, he was the only one willing to express them. And this was how they were feeling and acting, not right after the crucifixion, when it would have at least made some sense. This was how they were acting and feeling right after the resurrection. Not on Good Friday, but on Easter Sunday evening. So one has to ask and one has to wonder, had Easter made any difference to them and for them? And as today's gospel shows us, in one sense, the answer must have been yes, but in another sense, the answer clearly was no. And you and I, we can understand how both answers could have been true. We understand how both answers still are true. We understand because terrible and tragic things still happen in our communities, in our families, in our lives. Even after Easter, terrible and tragic things still happen. Prosecutors and sheriffs in West Virginia are killed. People are still shot just because they're walking down the streets at the wrong time and in the wrong place. And small children are still the target of sick people who try to abuse or to abduct them. There are still wars in countries throughout the world in which people are being killed. There's still a war in which American service people are still being killed. And there are still terrible diseases, and cancer is still a word that strikes fear in the hearts of probably all of us. So we have to wonder ourselves, and we have to ask, has Easter really made any difference? But we understand how the answer to that question, even for us, is both a yes and a no. Both a yes and a no in our world, and both a yes and a no in our own lives. Because today, we are the ones who at times feel like those other disciples did. And we are the ones who sometimes live like those giraffes. Today, we are the ones who are gathered here after Easter with our own reasons to feel and to be dejected. We are the ones who are here with our feeling as though some of our own dreams maybe have ended, as though some of our own hopes and somehow have been crushed. We're here today maybe with our own reasons to feel guilty, or to feel ashamed, or to feel rejected or unaccepted. We are here today with our own fears and with our own doubts, hiding behind our own versions of that same locked door in that same upper room, living as though we ourselves are caged and trapped by bars and by walls that no one can see. I mean, it's only been a week since Easter, and yet this is how we are feeling and how we are acting, gathered here in our usual place, maybe tormented by our own questions, by our own doubts, by our own concerns. So today invites us to ask, has Easter made any difference for us? You and I know that in a very real sense, the answer to that question is now. And this side of heaven, it seems, will always be no. Because there always seems to be more fog than sunshine, always seems to be more questions than answers. There always seems to be a certain amount in our own lives in which we feel as though I have no idea where I'm going. I can't see the road ahead of me. And if the truth be told, I really am not sure what I'm supposed to be doing. So in lots of ways, life today for us and life tomorrow for us will be the same as it was yesterday, the same as it was before last Easter Sunday, the same as it was before the very first Easter Sunday. But in other ways, life can never be, and life will never be the same again. Oh, we are still people who live far too much of our life between Good Friday and the resurrection. We're still people who can easily be held hostage by our own fears, our own doubts, our own memories, and our own guilt. We're still people who have more than our fair share of doubts and questions about ourselves and about life and about how God and about our faith fit in with all of it. But it's now the resurrected and risen Christ who shares that all and who bears that all with us. one who had his own doubts, the one who had his own fears, the one who had his own pain, the one who had his own death, is now the very same one who comes to us, just as he came to the disciples on the evening of that day, the first day of the week. And he, Jesus, now enters into the most fear-filled, the most doubt-filled, the most pain-filled places of our lives. And through Scripture and through bread and through wine, he somehow makes it possible, even today, for us to touch him and for us to be touched by him. It's this risen Christ who now comes to us in our fear and who says, peace be with you. It's this risen Christ who now comes to us in our guilt and who now says, peace be with you. It's this risen Christ who now comes to us in our doubts and in our questions and who says to us, peace be with you. And it's this risen Christ who not only says, peace be with you, but who also gives us the very peace that he promises and the very peace that we need. And if all those things weren't enough of an Easter gift, it's this same risen Christ whose presence and whose peace now makes it possible for us to somehow keep on hoping, for us to somehow keep on trusting, for us to somehow keep on believing, even when we still don't know where we are headed, and even though we still can't see all that lies ahead, and even though things seem to us sometimes in our own lives, in our own world, as just be going crazy, even though it sometimes seems as though no one can help, and even though it sometimes seems as though no one has enough answers for us. All that's true because we and Thomas, we have a lot in common. We have doubts for sure, but we have faith for sure. We also have the hand of the risen and living Christ leading us, and we have the love of the risen and living Christ supporting us. Because even after Easter, in some ways, nothing has changed for us. But thank goodness, indeed, thank God in other ways, in more important ways. Life can never be, life need never be, and life will never be the same for us again. Because, of course, it's true. Christ is risen. And because it's true, and because it's the risen Christ who now lives with us and who now lives in us, it's this same risen and living Christ who now comes to us today and any day and every day in the midst of any doubts and questions that we may have. It's this same risen and living Christ who now comes to us all and who now says to us all, the peace of the Lord be with you always. Not just when things are going great, but also when things are going terrible. Not just when we think we know everything, but also in those times when we're sure of what we don't know. Not just in terms and times of our faith, but also in times of our doubts. It's this same risen, living Christ who comes to us all and who says to us all, my peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. The peace of the Lord be with you always. Amen.
Yeah.
Now please stand as we sing the hymn.